Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt, cried the obese young woman, her voice choked with pain and shame. And no one in that luxurious room moved a finger. Just laughter. Laughter that cut deeper than any physical wound. What those women didn't know is that, at that very moment, a powerful man was walking toward the hall, and when he entered, everything would change. That public humiliation, which seemed like the end, would be the beginning of something that no one would ever forget. Sarah entered that restaurant as if stepping on forbidden territory. The golden lights reflected in the mirrors. The soft sound of the piano echoed in the background, and the expensive perfume of the environment mixed with the bittersweet smell of expectation. She knew she stood out there. The simple dress, the hair pulled back without much care, the timid look of someone who fears being noticed. But, for love, she was willing to face that discomfort. After all, it was her husband's birthday, and all she wanted was to be part of, even in silence, the world he frequented so much. But for some people, simplicity is provocation. That's when three women, adorned with jewelry and sharp laughter, decided that Sarah would be the joke of the night. They laughed at her body, as if the word obese were synonymous with neglect, pointed at her cheap dress, mocked the way she moved. Their laughter wasn't innocent. It was the kind of laughter that carries venom, the kind that seeks to hurt and mark. And, in the middle of that bright hall, Sarah's kindness was crushed by the contempt of those who confuse status with human value. She tried to disguise the embarrassment with a hesitant smile, but her face betrayed the pain. The waiter pretended not to see, like so many who remain silent in the face of the absurd. And it's curious how cowardice disguises itself as neutrality, isn't it? No one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to lose the comfort of their bubbles of indifference. The women increased the volume of their laughter, as if the louder they mocked, the more powerful they became. Sarah pressed her hands on her lap, trying to contain the trembling, wishing to disappear. In her eyes there was that shine that only those who have been ridiculed understand. A mixture of shame and helplessness, an almost childish wish that someone would appear and say enough. But no one did. The cruel words spread through the air like invisible darts, and each laugh was a blow that wounded deeper. That kind of public humiliation is a wound that doesn't leave bruises, but marks the soul like red-hot iron. And, deep down, everyone knew that was wrong. It's just that the fear of getting involved is, many times, the greatest accomplice of injustice. At that moment, Sarah looked around and realized how small the world can be when people's hearts are empty. The entire hall seemed to move away, as if she were isolated inside an aquarium of shame. Every word, every laugh, every look of contempt formed a cruel chorus that echoed inside her. But what those women didn't imagine is that fate likes to write its stories upside down. Because, while they were having fun with the pain of an innocent, the true owner of that gastronomic empire was approaching the scene, and the same stage that now served for humiliation was about to transform into a silent courtroom. It was just a matter of time until the mask of arrogance began to fall. And when that happened, those women would discover that the world turns faster than the sound of their own laughter. Suddenly, the laughter became something even more sinister. One of the women, intoxicated by the sensation of power that only the cruel know, stood up from the table with a look full of malice. She approached Sarah with slow steps, savoring the discomfort of others as one tastes an expensive wine. "Did you really think that dress went with that body?" she whispered, before pulling the fabric roughly. The sound of the tear cut through the air, and the entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The piece of dress hung in her hand, like a trophy of cowardice. Sarah, in shock, tried to cover herself, but it was too late. The laughter spread again, louder, more aggressive, as if one woman's shame could be entertainment for the others. She fell to her knees, her face wet with tears, trying to hide her body with her own hands. "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt," she murmured, her voice broken, a plea for compassion that sounded like an echo lost in a desert of empty souls. But compassion didn't live there. Cruelty, when it feels unpunished, transforms into spectacle. And what happened at that moment was more than a scene of humiliation. It was the exact portrait of how humanity can lose itself amid luxury and appearance. The other women laughed uncontrollably, like hyenas around a defenseless prey, without realizing that, with each laugh, They reveal how far they were from any trace of greatness. Sarah, trembling, held the torn fabric against her chest, trying to preserve the minimum dignity she had left. The waiter, paralyzed, watched with guilt. Some customers whispered. Others pretended not to see, fearing involvement. And there, on that cold floor between tears and shame, a good woman learned in the hardest way that prejudice doesn't need reason. It only needs an audience. What no one expected is that this theater of cruelty was about to have an interruption that would change the course of the story. In the middle of the chaos, while the laughter echoed and Sarah cried, the sound of firm steps began to cross the hall. An uncomfortable silence began to take over the environment, as if the air itself had become heavier. The women were still laughing, but something in the eyes of others began to change. An uneasiness, a premonition that something wasn't right. And in fact, it wasn't, because the man who was approaching carried in his eyes a silent fury, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. He stopped at the door, observed the scene, and time seemed to stop. The woman on the floor was the same one he promised to protect, the same one who taught him the meaning of true love. And even before any word, his look was enough for the laughter to cease. It was Michael. And what would come next would transform that night and all the emotional stories that would emerge from it into an unforgettable lesson about respect, justice, and love. The hall, previously taken by laughter, plunged into an uncomfortable silence. Michael was standing at the entrance, motionless, but his presence spoke louder than any scream. The impeccable suit, the firm gaze, and a countenance loaded with disbelief formed a scene that no one would dare interrupt. He didn't need to ask what had happened. Sarah's trembling body, the torn dress, and the tears staining the floor said everything. A shiver ran through the environment. It was as if the air had been ripped from people, as if time had split in two, before and after his arrival. Michael took a few steps forward, and each movement seemed to weigh tons. Eyes turned to him, and fear began to sprout on the faces of those women who, until seconds before, thought they owned the world. The laughter died. Shame, finally, changed that dress. Michael knelt before his wife, extending his hand with the delicacy of one who knows the value of what he has. "Sarah," he murmured in a low voice, but loaded with pain and tenderness. She lifted her eyes, not understanding how that man could still look at her with so much love after seeing her in that state. And he, with his voice breaking, just said, "You shouldn't be on the floor. Never." Those words, simple, broke the silence like lightning. There was a force in them that disarmed even the proudest of those present. Michael helped her up, covered her with his own jacket, and hugged her, ignoring all the looks. In that gesture, there was a message that needed no explanation. True love is not ashamed. And for the first time that night, Sarah cried not from pain, but from relief, the relief of being seen, respected, loved without conditions. Michael's eyes, now firm, turned to the women, and there, without needing to raise his voice, he did what many dream of doing in the face of injustice. He placed each one of them in front of the mirror of their own cruelty. "Do you think it's nice to laugh at someone's pain?" he asked, and the silence was absolute. "You laughed at her body, mocked her appearance. But what do you see when you look at yourselves? Greatness? Or fear of being nothing without humiliating others?" No one answered. The shame that was previously Sarah's now burned on the skin of the aggressors. The hall, which minutes before vibrated with evil, was now dominated by a mute respect. Michael held his wife's hand firmly and, looking around, made it clear that this story was still far from over, because the real twist was still to come, and it would bring not only justice, but revelation capable of changing everything. When Michael stood up, with his arms still around Sarah, the entire hall seemed to wait for the outcome of a spectacle that no one wanted to watch anymore. The waiter, motionless, held the tray with trembling hands. Customers exchanged embarrassed looks, and the women, now pale, tried to disguise their fear. Michael took a deep breath, looked around, and asked calmly, "Does anyone here know who I am?" The question hung in the air, loaded with a silent authority. The three women looked at each other, confused, not understanding the reason for that. One of them, still trying to maintain her pose, laughed nervously and answered, "An overly loving husband, perhaps." Her smile lasted little. It was enough for Michael to drop the jacket, take his phone from his pocket, and show the company's digital badge on the screen. The restaurant chain logo stamped on the screen. His name right below, Michael Parker, CEO and owner. A murmur ran through the environment. In a matter of seconds, the entire hall knew that this man wasn't just any customer. He was the owner, the man behind every detail, every waiter, every dish, every laugh that, until then, seemed harmless. The reaction was instantaneous. The women froze, as if reality had slapped them in the face. The restaurant manager, who was watching from afar, approached hurriedly, sweating cold, mumbling apologies. Low voices began to spread to the tables. He's the owner, she's his wife? My God, what did they do? The climate changed completely. What was once arrogance became desperation. What was once mockery became shame. Michael looked directly at the aggressors, and the calmness in his voice was more frightening than any scream. The woman you call public shame is the reason this place exists. She is my wife, the soul of my life. The silence that formed was deafening. The women lowered their eyes, unable to sustain his gaze. Their mask of superiority shattered in seconds, revealing what had always been behind it. Insecurity, envy, and a vanity built on the suffering of others. And at that moment, something profound happened. The people around began to applaud, not for spectacle, but out of respect. It was as if the world, for a moment, had returned to the right axis. Sarah, still with her face wet with tears, looked at Michael in disbelief. He hugged her once more and, with a firm voice, said, "Never feel less for being who you are. I'm the luckiest man in the world to have you." The women tried to justify themselves, babbling words that no longer had weight. "It was a joke," they said. But the truth is that cruelty is never a joke. It's a choice. And they had chosen to hurt. The irony was bitter. The same people who humiliated her for seeming outside the standard now trembled before her, knowing they had outraged the wife of the billionaire who sustained the luxury they flaunted so much. Fate, sometimes, is too poetic to be coincidence. Michael didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His power was in his gaze, that gaze that mixes disappointment, authority, and a dangerous calm. While the women trembled, he gestured to the manager. "Bring the security footage. Now!" The man swallowed hard and obeyed. In a few minutes, the hall's projector turned on, and the images began to play on the main wall. Every laugh, every insult, every cruel gesture was exposed before everyone, without cuts or excuses. The scene that was previously confined to Sarah's memory now became public. Only this time, the embarrassment had changed sides. The women covered their faces. Some customers stood up indignant, and the waiter, with teary eyes, apologized for not having intervened. Michael watched everything without blinking, like one who allows truth to do the work of justice. "You want an audience, didn't you?" he said in a low voice. "Well, now everyone can see the kind of people you are." The environment was so tense that even the air seemed to vibrate. Sarah, still shaken, watched in silence. There was no hatred in her eyes, just a deep sadness, the kind that teaches more than any revenge. Michael then turned to the manager, a man in an elegant suit, but with an expression of guilt stamped on his face. "And you?" he asked calmly. "You watched everything and did nothing." That kind of silence is what allows evil to keep growing. The man tried to justify himself, stuttering, but there was no excuse. "You're fired. Right now." The words fell like a hammer on the floor. The manager lowered his head, and the sound of his badge being left on the table was the only audible noise. Michael took a deep breath and turned to the aggressors. "You're banned from entering any establishment in my chain. Money can buy luxury, but it can't erase the shame of having no character." And it was there at that moment that the speech that would mark the night emerged. Michael placed his hand on Sarah's shoulder and said, looking at everyone, "You laughed at her body, mocked her appearance, but it was this woman, precisely her, who taught me what love and respect are. While the world judges by form, she taught me to see content. While you measure people by appearance, she showed me the value of the soul." The hall filled with emotional murmurs. Some applauded, others cried. Sarah, embarrassed, just squeezed her husband's hand tightly. It was as if the universe had returned, Right there, a piece of dignity that had been taken from her minutes before. Michael wasn't just a rich man defending his wife. He was a symbol of what happens when someone with power chooses truth instead of omission. And what would come after? What would come after would transform that moment into something much greater than an act of justice. Hours later, when the hall finally emptied and the murmur gave way to silence, Sarah and Michael remained alone at the table. The floor still reflected the shine of the golden lights, but the environment, previously oppressive, now seemed lighter, as if the truth had cleaned the air. Sarah kept her eyes down, absent-mindedly fiddling with the edge of the napkin, still trying to process everything that had happened. "I embarrass you in front of everyone," she murmured, with a weak voice, barely able to look at him. Michael watched her in silence for a moment, before smiling tenderly. "Do you really think what embarrasses me is your body?" he asked, moving closer. "What would embarrass me would be allowing someone to hurt you and me staying silent." His words came like an invisible hug, healing what the world tried to destroy. Sarah began to cry, but this time was different. It wasn't pain, it was liberation. Michael held her hand on the table and, with a voice that seemed to contain the weight of 1,000 truths, said, "It was this body that gave me the most beautiful home I've ever had. It was this body that welcomed me when I was just an empty man trying to prove my own worth. It was in this body that I learned what love is, real love, that can't be bought, that doesn't need an audience." Sarah looked at him with teary eyes, unable to say anything. He continued, "Never lower your head again for who you are. Whoever doesn't understand your value, it's because they live a life so shallow they drown in their own vanity." The way he said that wasn't just comfort. It was a declaration of principles. He wasn't speaking just to his wife, but to all people who ever felt small before the eyes of others. Because true love, when it manifests, becomes testimony, and every word said at that table seemed written for all the real stories of those who once believed they didn't deserve to be loved. Sarah took a deep breath and rested her head on his shoulder. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could rest within an embrace. There, in the middle of an empty restaurant, surrounded only by echoes of cruel past, a new chapter was born. Michael kissed her forehead and said, "I always knew you would be stronger than all of them together." She smiled, still between tears, and answered, "Do you really believe that?" He nodded with conviction. "I don't believe it, I see it. And now the world will see it too." And at that moment, their love ceased to be just feeling. It became purpose. It was as if the universe, in its silent justice, had shown that no pain is in vain when truth is greater than appearance. What Sarah didn't imagine is that what would be born from that conversation would be much greater than a personal lesson. It would be the beginning of a change that would touch other lives, reigniting hope in those who also carried the invisible weight of prejudice. The next morning, the sun seemed different. The light passed through the curtains softly, tinting the room with golden and warm tones, as if the day itself was asking forgiveness for the previous night. Sarah woke up slowly, feeling the weight of exhaustion mixed with a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Michael was already awake, sitting in the armchair beside her, watching her with a serene but deep look, the kind of look that doesn't seek answers, just understands. When she opened her eyes, he smiled. "Good morning, my courage," he said in a light tone, but loaded with feeling. Sarah smiled back, surprised by the choice of words. "Courage?" she asked. He approached, held her hand, and answered, "Yes." Because only a courageous woman faces a world and still chooses to love after everything. The phrase remained echoing between them, slow, meaningful. It was the kind of love that isn't explained, only recognized. During breakfast, the silence between them was comfortable. The aroma of fresh bread and hot coffee, mixed with the distant sound of the city waking up. Sarah looked at her husband and said, "Yesterday, when you entered that hall, I felt shame, not for me, but for them, for the smallness of each one." Michael listened to her attentively. "They don't know what love is," he answered. "They live trapped in a display window, believing the reflection is the truth. But the beauty measured by the mirror dies when the glass breaks. Yours, Sarah, is one of those that survives time." She looked away, moved, and whispered, "For years, I tried to fit into molds that suffocated me. They told me I was too much, then that I was too little. that I needed a change to deserve respect. Michael touched her face delicately and answered, "You never needed a change. The world is what needs to learn to see." His words were like a bomb. Sarah felt something inside her reorganize, as if all the broken pieces finally found the right place. And for the first time, she realized that the forgiveness she needed to offer wasn't just to the people who hurt her. It was also to herself for having believed them. She got up, went to the window, and took a deep breath, letting the sun touch her face. Out there, the city remained the same, but inside her something had changed forever. Michael hugged her from behind, with the calm of one who understands silence. "Shall we start over?" he asked, whispering near her ear. She turned with teary eyes and answered, "We don't need to start over, Michael. We just need continue, but now truly together." He smiled, and in that smile was a promise of future without masks. Their love finally was clean, healed, and whole, because truth, when accepted, reconciles not just hearts, but souls. After everything they lived through, Michael and Sarah understood that the pain couldn't be wasted. It needed to become something greater, something that could transform the lives of other people who, like Sarah, had been hurt by the cruel gaze of prejudice. It was on a simple morning, having coffee on the balcony, that the idea was born. Michael, watching his wife with that new shine in her eyes, said, "What if we create a place where women like you could find support, voice, and courage?" Sarah remained silent for a few seconds, feeling her heart beat faster. It was as if all the suffering from before had a hidden purpose, waiting for that moment to flourish. Thus was born the Strong Heart Foundation, a space of shelter, empathy, and reconstruction, dedicated to supporting women victims of fat phobia and rejection. At first, it was just a small office in downtown New York City, with walls painted yellow and the smell of hope. Sarah spent the afternoons listening to emotional stories of women who had been humiliated, rejected, ignored, real stories that hurt but also inspired. Every tear that fell was welcomed. Every word of pain was transformed into a seed of restart. Michael took care of the structure, the partnerships, the donations, but it was Sarah who gave soul to the foundation. She spoke with the women with the sweetness of one who understands exactly what they felt. "It's not the body that needs to change," she said firmly. "It's the gaze of those who judge it." Over time, that small room became a reference center, and the name Strong Heart began to resonate as a symbol of resistance, courage, and self-love. The cameras began to appear. Journalists wanted interviews, but Sarah never sought fame. She just wanted to make a difference. One day, at a foundation event, she went up on stage in front of hundreds of people and told her story, not with sadness, but with pride. The audience stood up, applauding, and many women cried, finally feeling seen. At that moment, Sarah understood that her personal struggle had become collective. The body that was once the reason for jokes now represented strength and liberation. Michael, moved, watched her from the back of the hall, and in his eyes was a certainty that everything, every tear, every wound, every humiliation, had been worth it. And although the past had been cruel, the future now rose with new colors, promising a path where no woman would need to ask anymore, "Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt." Months later, Sarah found herself face to face with a woman who, on that fateful day, had humiliated her in the restaurant. The scenario was now different. A small auditorium at the Strong Heart Foundation, illuminated by natural light, surrounded by women who came there seeking support and transformation. The former socialite, still impeccably dressed, but visibly different in expression and posture, approached with hesitation. Sarah felt the tension in the air, the mixture of anxiety and expectation, but also knew that this was a chance to demonstrate the strength that had been born from her own scars. I'm so sorry," the woman began, her voice trembling, loaded with regret. "For everything I said and did, I have no excuses." Sarah remained silent for a few seconds, letting each word cross the space between them. The audience, silent, awaited the outcome, aware that they were about to witness something greater than any grudge. Then Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the depth of forgiveness arise within her. She didn't just want a statement of regret. She wanted to show that true strength comes from transforming pain into learning. She looked into the woman's eyes and said firmly, but without hatred, "What you called ugliness what you mocked and ridiculed, gave me the courage you'll never have. You were afraid of me when I was on the floor. Now, I give you back the opportunity to learn from what happened." There was tenderness in her voice, but also an authority that only the experience of overcoming provides. The woman bowed slightly, and tears began to fall down the face that before only laughed at the suffering of others. Sarah realized that forgiveness didn't diminish her own pain, but expanded her freedom, opening the way so the past wouldn't imprison her anymore. The entire auditorium breathed with relief, and a respectful silence took over the space. The woman who once humiliated, now kneeling in a symbolic gesture of humility, felt the weight of redemption touch her soul. Sarah, with the serenity of one who has already won internal battles, extended her hand, and together they sealed that moment with a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. It wasn't friendship that was born there, but consciousness and learning. Michael, present by her side, held Sarah's hand discreetly, proud, knowing that his wife had become not only a symbol of resistance, but also of compassion. And as the former socialite withdrew, changed by the lesson, Sarah realized that true power isn't in humiliating or punishing, but in transforming and elevating, and that sometimes the greatest act of strength is simply to forgive. Today, Sarah walks the city streets with her head held high, as if the world itself had changed to accompany her step. She no longer needs to hide her body, nor fear the looks of others. Every curve of her body, every feature that was once the reason for mockery, is now a symbol of strength, resistance, and authenticity. And more than that, Sarah learned that the real weight that hurts isn't that of the body, but that of the cruel words that try to define us. Every malicious comment, every unexpected laugh, every gesture of contempt transformed into impulse to be stronger, more conscious, and more generous. Michael's love not only healed her wounds, but also became a beacon for all women who once felt small before the world. Sarah now understands. A person's value can never be measured by other standards, but by the power to remain whole in the face of adversity. In the work of the Strong Heart Foundation, Sarah finds her true vocation. She talks with women who suffer rejection, humiliation, and discrimination, listening to emotional stories that resonate like echoes of her own journey. She teaches that every scar, every tear, is fuel for reconstruction. Every gesture of empathy is a step to transform suffering into hope. And there, in the same space that once represented pain, Sarah realizes how much strength love and truth have. Michael watches from afar, proud, knowing that together they manage to transform personal experiences into collective changes. The couple became a living example that overcoming is not only possible, but necessary for society to evolve and for every woman to be able to see her own beauty, without fear or shame. The message Sarah leaves for everyone who follows her story is simple but powerful. True courage isn't in changing for those who look at us, but in remaining faithful to oneself, even when everyone tries to diminish us. It's in self-acceptance, in forgiveness, and in building new paths that true freedom is found. Michael, by her side, reinforces that lesson. To love genuinely is to see value beyond appearances, to protect those you love, and to transform pain into learning. Today, Sarah isn't just a woman who suffered. She's a woman who won, who inspires, who leads by example, and who proves that dignity, when preserved, creates bridges of love, respect, and hope for everyone. And so, every step she takes is an affirmation. Never lower your head again. Never let cruel words define your life. And always remember that what matters is the strength of the heart. Now that you've learned Sarah's story, reflect. How many times have you allowed cruel words or the looks of others to define who you are? The real weight that hurts isn't in the body, but in the injustices we carry. Sarah and Michael show us that genuine love, truth, and courage have the power to transform lives. Ask yourself, do you have the courage to love yourself, forgive those who hurt you, and move forward stronger? Change begins when you decide that you're no longer going to bow to the judgment of others, but will lift your head and walk with strength, confidence, and self-love. Share this story. Inspire those who need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue learning how to transform pain into courage and fear into strength.